Hi, and thank you so much for joining us today for this EIPA Skills Development mini lesson focusing on indicating who is speaking. I am Megan Seipke Dame.
And I am Erin Seipke Brown. Welcome.
Before we get into our mini lesson, I just want to take a moment to introduce myself. I am an educational interpreter here in Michigan. I have been working as an educational interpreter for 20 years. I graduated from Madonna University in 2002 with a BS in Business Administration and a BA in 2003 in Sign Language Studies with a concentration in interpreting. I am both a nationally and state certified interpreter. I hold the RID NIC and EdK 12, as well as a BEI Advanced state level certification. I hold an elementary EIPA PSE 5.0, secondary EIPA PSE 4.6, and I passed the written test. Under the promulgated rules and regulations here in Michigan, I meet the qualifications of a standard level 2 certified interpreter, as well as an elementary level interpreter and secondary level interpreter. I hold state of Michigan endorsements for both medical mental health and deafblind. And while I specialize in the field of educational interpreting, I do also work as a video relay interpreter and do some community work and theatrical work. While I graduated with my undergraduate quite a long time ago, I am currently a master's student in the Masters of Interpreting Studies at Western Oregon University. I am pursuing the teaching track as well as a graduate certificate in educational interpreting.
I too work as an educational interpreter full time in the state of Michigan. I've been working as an educational interpreter for more than 20 years now and have been at my current district for more than 16. My bachelor's degree is in sign language studies with a concentration in interpreting. I completed it in 2001 at Madonna University in Livonia, Michigan. Though I work full-time as an educational interpreter, I too have experience as a video relay service interpreter and a community interpreter. In addition to my bachelor's degree, I am a nationally and state level certified interpreter. I have certification from RID, which is the NIC and also the Ed K-12, and my state level certification is the BEI Advanced. My elementary EIPA test score is a 4.5 in the PSE, and my secondary PSE EIPA is a 4.4. Those two scores, along with my written test, qualified me for the Ed K-12. In the state of Michigan, I am qualified as a standard level 2 interpreter, which means I was also able to add a medical mental health endorsement to my credentials. In addition to that, I am qualified in the state of Michigan to interpret at both elementary and secondary educational settings, and I carry an additional endorsement for working with those who are deafblind. Like Megan, I also am a student again, attending Western Oregon University, pursuing a degree, master's degree in interpreting studies, focusing on teaching interpreting with an additional graduate certificate in educational interpreting.
Again, we want to thank you for joining us for this mini lesson on indicating who is speaking. We would ask that you don't share this PowerPoint outside of those who are present and taking this mini lesson. Indicating who is speaking is a critical part of signed language structure and grammar. It is something that is assessed in multiple locations within the EIPA, and you can see the results of those assessments within the EIPA report. The EIPA is the Educational Interpreter's Performance Assessment. It is a diagnostic assessment tool that was developed and is administered by Boys Town National Research Hospital, and it is a tool that is used to assess an interpreter's ability and skills in meeting the developmental language and cognitive and social emotional areas of the youth that we are serving within the schools. There currently is no certification test specific to educational interpreting. The RID NIC is a generalist certificate, and the BEI is as well. While there is no certification test specific to educational interpreting, we do have the EIPA. And the EIPA currently is the best assessment tool that we have in determining the skill level and being able to meet those needs of DHH language learners within a K-12 environment.
At this point in time, what we are starting to see nationally is more states choosing to implement a credentialing standard of some kind that incorporates having achieved a minimum score on an EIPA test, regardless or specifically for any particular testing modality. As interpreters, though, it is important for us to be as clear as we can about the credentials that we hold. While there are some states that use an EIPA score as the basis for issuing an interpreting credential in a state, that is not the same as indicating that we are EIPA certified. Because the EIPA is a diagnostic skills assessment, it is a test. It is not a certification. Some states, however, will use your EIPA to issue you a certification or a credential that qualifies you to do the work of an educational interpreter in the state where you live. But if we're being clear and transparent about our credentials and representing those honestly, it's important that we understand that EIPA certification is not a certification.
Another important thing to note as we are talking about accurately representing our credentials, again, the EIPA is utilized as an interpreting credential. Again, it is not certification. It's also important to accurately discuss what the EIPA score does and does not mean. All too frequently, we hear individuals say, I failed the EIPA or I passed the EIPA. Last I checked, I have never known anyone to get a 0.0 on the EIPA. Because it is a diagnostic skills assessment, it is scored on a scale of 0.0 to 5.0 and each point in between. You can have a 4.1, a 4.2, a 3.7. It is not a pass-fail exam. It is a rated skills assessment. While there are some that have come to understand that this terminology of pass-fail is in relationship to any one individual's state and that state's required minimum assessment score, it does not equate to pass and fail. IDEA is the special education law that students with disabilities who have IEPs fall under. An IEP is an individualized education plan. IDEA, just like the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, does have language indicating that interpreters are to be qualified. What neither piece of legislation indicates, however, is what qualified is defined as. There is nothing in either piece of legislation about certification, licensure, established minimum standards. They do indicate qualified, and they also indicate effective communication. What happens then is the definition of qualified is left to each individual state to determine what qualified is going to be assessed as. For example, in the state of Michigan, to be qualified as an educational interpreter, I have to have an EIPA of a 4.0 or higher, and I have to have passed the EIPA written test. Notice I did say passed the written test. The written test portion of the EIPA is the only portion that is a pass-fail component. The performance assessment, where your interpreting skills are actually analyzed and scored, is just that. It is a scored assessment.
So to sum up, as we're talking about our EIPA scores, if we try to indicate that we have passed or failed the performance portion of the assessment, this becomes confusing if I, from Michigan, say that I failed the EIPA, having scored a 3.9, when if somebody from the state of Alabama does not understand my score to be failing because their minimum score requirement is a 3.5 or a 3.3. Based on my standards, I may have failed the test, but based on the standards of another state, I did not. This is why it is important that we try to avoid the use of terms pass and fail when we are discussing our EIPA scores. So, as we start to look at the EIPA report, first we need to recognize that there are 4 different sections of the report that provide us a score. Each of these sections is referred to as a Roman. Roman 1 focuses on our interpreting product that is produced from voice to sign. Roman 2 focuses on our interpreting product from sign to voice. Roman 3 focuses on our vocabulary, both in ASL and in English. And Roman 4 looks at the overall factors of our interpreting product. It's an amalgamation of everything that we do. When we go through and we review the report and identify the different places where our skills in indicating who is speaking are being assessed, we see these skills present in multiple subskills in 2 different Romans. First, we look to Roman 1, interpreter product of voice to sign, and we see the skill of use of signing space and interpreter performance. There are 2 different subskills under use of signing space where we see that we are being assessed on our ability to indicate who is speaking. This is present in subskill G, the use of verb directionality and the pronominal system. You may or may not have already seen our mini lesson provided on verb directionality and the pronominal system. If you have not yet, we would recommend seeking out that mini lesson in order to take a closer look at that particular subskill. Subskill I is the location relationship using ASL classifier system. In the skill of interpreter performance, we look to subskill J, which follows the grammar of ASL
Karen
or
mentioned earlier
PSE.
that Roman 4 is looking at overall factors. Roman 4 is where we see all the different components coming together into one coherent interpreted message. What are the overall skill levels assessed within this interpreted product? If we look at the message processing that is evaluated under Roman 4, it's looking to see whether or not the appropriate eye contact and movement has been included. Within message clarity, the assessors want to see that you are following the principles of discourse mapping. Discourse mapping is one of the most difficult skills to understand. It is quite literally the culmination of everything that we are doing to map out an interpretation. Any one interpreter can turn to an EIPA report that he or she has received, turn to look at Roman 4, and the lowest subskill number that the interpreter is going to see on the report, almost every single time I have yet to find an aberration, that lowest score is going to fall within the principles of discourse mapping. Finally, we have the environment itself in which we are interpreting. Is the interpreter indicating who is speaking? It's very important when you have an interpreted education for the interpreter to take something that is implicit, such as the source of a message, and making that explicit. Students who are deaf and hard of hearing may or may not be using hearing assistive technology. For somebody whose hearing status is measuring without any loss of decibel access, that person has the ability to hear a sound and identify the origin of that sound. As such, if I identify that there's a person in the corner speaking, I can turn to look at that person. It's important to understand that with hearing assistive technology, while the sound itself may be amplified, the quality that we are using as far as the reverberation and being able to identify where that noise came from is typically lost. So while the student may have access to the sound itself, the student doesn't necessarily have the ability to identify where the sound came from. This is especially true for those students who have all of the sound routed into one processor. Again, gaining access to that sound is not the same as being able to access that sound naturally without hearing assistive technology and being able to identify where that comes from. Often what this leads to is a student who hears a noise but is now distracted in trying to figure out where the source of that noise came from. If we pair that with the fact that most students who are deaf and hard of hearing are typically seated at the front center of the classroom, preferential seating, all of the students' peers then are sitting to the sides and behind the student. So as the hearing peers sitting behind the student who is deaf and hard of hearing are speaking, the student may very well be turning around to figure out which classmate is saying any one thing.
This coping behavior is very disruptive to a deaf or hard of hearing student's learning process. This means it is of critical importance for us as interpreters to ensure that we are conveying accurately and meaningfully who is speaking to whom, and environmental noises that have an impact on the student's learning environment and on the instruction and the dialogue and discourse that occurs within that classroom. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the factors to consider and ways we can address these things. One of the first things that we want to do is we want to seek out mentor texts. Mentor texts are video sources wherein we have the opportunity to observe native L1 first language users of ASL in order to study and analyze and understand the ways that fluent native ASL users are indicating who is speaking. These mentor texts give us the opportunity to see how indicating who is speaking in specific ways is most effective in order for us to start growing and building our skills to mimic those, which improves our ability to convey speaker information to students in a more natural, organic, and meaningful manner. One of the first mentor texts that we recommend based on our own practice and our own experience are video texts by Peter Cook. Peter Cook is a deaf storyteller and is very skilled and adept at indicating who is speaking in a meaningful way that is easy to identify and provides us with guidance that we're able to start growing in our own skills by viewing. A video that we would recommend based on our use and experience for you to look to as a mentor text can be found on YouTube, and the name of the story is Princess Belly Button. In this story, we see a young princess named Princess Belly Button who interacts with different characters. And it is through her interactions with these different characters that we see many different ways that Peter is able to indicate who is
Another mentor
speaking
text that we would
throughout the
recommend
story.
would be videos from the ASL performer Keith Wan. Keith Wan is hearing, but he's also a child of deaf adults. He uses ASL as his native language, but of course he's also fluent in English. As a performer, he is very adept at characterization and showing us examples of how we can take techniques and improve our skill. Whether it's one of his own performances or whether it is a children's story that is being told, his videos are full of rich language that we can incorporate and try to mimic within our own practice. This particular example that I've provided is one that I have used in my own deliberate practice, and it's green eggs with pig meat. Keith is very good at playing with language, and that is one of the most obvious signs of language fluency is when you have a language user who can start to play and have fun with the language. Things like puns in English, that fluency is what gives a pun its humor. What's really great about this particular video is that it's an ASL retelling of the Dr. Seuss classic Green Eggs and Ham. Keith very easily uses several different techniques simultaneously to indicate who is speaking. And Dr. Seuss is notoriously difficult for a lot of interpreters to perform because of the incorporation of nonsensical English words. However, it's also a very freeing experience for some interpreters because the nonsensical language gives us the ability to step back from the form of the book and really look at the function and the point. And it gives us the ability to play with ASL the same way that Dr. Seuss plays with English. Another excellent mentor text that you could use that is not included on this list would be any videos done by MJ Bienvenue. MJ Bienvenue is a deaf professor at Gallaudet University and has a very clear, very functional way of communicating in ASL. As a professor, as somebody with her own educational background, her language is very academic. And as you progress through, an interpreting program, more and more we're hearing about academic ASL. Yet there's still not a lot of understanding from most interpreters in the field to what the differences in academic ASL and conversational ASL really are. So mentor texts from MJ Bienvenue, not only can we see the incorporation of different conventions for indicating who is speaking or any other skill that you're trying to look at, but we can see very beautiful, clear examples of academic ASL.
So if we analyze a piece of mentor text from, say, Peter Cook or from Keith Wan, what we are going to see is several different conventions for indicating who is speaking. We would like to go through what these conventions are and then provide you with an example of what that may look like. The first method that we see of indicating who is speaking is with eye gaze. This can be simply a matter of looking at the person who is speaking. Our incorporation of eye gaze and looking to who is speaking is enough to direct the attention of the student that we are interpreting for to look and see who the speaker is, and then they will return their gaze to us as we continue our interpretation. Frequently paired with eye gaze is the use of indexing. Indexing is our ASL linguistics way of saying we point to the person. By pointing to the person, we are showing who is speaking,
One of the most
even if we do
common
not necessarily look at
approaches
them.
to indicating who is speaking is the use of body shifting. We will see this often when an interpreter is having to interpret something where it's a he said, she said kind of conversation. Whereas this person said this person responded. Body shifting can be an incredibly effective tool. That said, the more characters that are introduced into any interpreted situation, the more complicated body shifting becomes. It can be done effectively, but again, this is where the mentor texts come into play because it's not something that comes inherently or naturally to an interpreter who learned ASL as a second language. It's a skill that can be developed with time. But because this kind of situation where you have more and more and more individuals within this conversation happens less frequently, it's important that we do look to mentor texts or working with a mentor in order to develop this particular skill.
The next convention on our list is the use of description. We might use description in a circumstance where the person for whom we are interpreting cannot actually look to see who it is, or we may not know who the person is, but we can describe what it is that they look like in order to provide that visual and in order to set up the space in which we are interpreting so that we can now have a visual description of an entity that we can reference while we are interpreting to indicate this is a person who spoke and this is a person who spoke. Outside of that description, another convention is simply for us to name or label that person. If we refer to the mentor text that we mentioned earlier from Peter Cook called Princess Belly Button, one of the conventions that he very frequently uses throughout his story is to name Princess Belly Button and let us know that that is who is speaking.
If we're in a situation
It can
where
be
either the
that
student
simple
or the
and very
interpreter
effective.
doesn't necessarily know the speaker's name, it can be enough to just label who is speaking. Teacher, boy, girl, something general just to give the student some idea of the source of the message. This is something that we can also do during the EIPA assessment. We want to treat the assessment just like we would a classroom environment. If another student has a comment or response to a question, the teacher may or may not refer to that student by name. If the teacher uses the name, by all means, Billy, indicate that Billy is speaking, and then you can sign the answer. If, however, there's no name, but we can tell or have a pretty good guess whether it's, a boy or a girl, we can still include that information because that environmental information provides context to the student who's accessing education through an interpreter. Finally, another convention that we can use is something often referred to as constructed action or constructed dialogue. It's basically characterization, whereas the interpreter takes on the character or works through the dialogue. If, for example, it's a conversation between, you know, parents that the student is retelling, the student could take on the role of dad. And we can see that, mom is taking on a softer approach, dad's taking the more stern approach. And by showing the physicality of the people having the conversation, the student can discern, oh, well, that's one person and that's another person. It is often incorporated along with other aspects or other approaches to indicating who is speaking. If I am performing constructed action, I am still incorporating things like body shifting, but it's a step beyond that. It's the body shifting, but also with taking on the characteristics of who it is that's speaking. Oftentimes, as interpreters, we hear show, don't tell, but we're not really sure what that is or how to do it. At the same time, we can see performers like Peter Cook doing what he does so incredibly well. And we can sit back and think, I want to be him when I grow up. One of the things that we as second language learners do is we can see and identify those qualities that really make for fluent language. Where we struggle is taking those same qualities and being able to reproduce them within our own interpreting.
It's important that we consider the impact of our ability to effectively convey who is speaking, not just from the perspective of how can I do this to get a better score on my EIPA test, but rather the pragmatic application of these skills to our work in classroom settings. Megan before mentioned students who utilize hearing assistive technology. And whether that's a hearing aid or a cochlear implant or a different listening device, a student's ability to understand where sound is coming from and know who is speaking is very important right now because we are still currently in pandemic conditions due to COVID-19. It's even more important and more difficult to effectively incorporate speaker indication in our interpretations. What we see is that because interpreters and students and teachers and all other staff are, when in buildings, having to wear a mask, it makes it difficult to see who is talking because we can no longer see the mouth. It makes it more difficult to hear who is talking, making it further more difficult to understand where am I looking to find out who is speaking. So our ability to indicate who is speaking is more important now than ever in order to provide meaningful information to deaf and hard of hearing learners. If, on the other hand, we're in situations where now we're not even in a classroom to provide our services, but having to provide those services remotely through an online platform such as through Google Meets or through Zoom or another online program, we have to consider the fact that what we see on our screens is not identical to what students see on their screens. We have to consider the fact that depending on the number of participants in any one online meeting, speakers may be across multiple screens. Speakers may have their videos off and we cannot see who a speaker is. The order of the videos are not in the same locations on my screen versus a student's screen. These are all very real, very pragmatic examples of how our ability to indicate who is speaking is being impacted by the environment. So it's important that we develop
right.
strong
Before we
skills
move
in
to the next
indicating
slide,
who
I
is
do want to
speaking
address what Erin was talking
in
about
order to best
in regard
support
to
deaf and hard of
indicating who's
hearing
speaking
learners.
when class is meeting remotely. While programs like Zoom do have features that will highlight the little window that the speaker is in, the program defaults to the voice that it detects. For students who are deaf and hard of hearing, who may be signing and not speaking for themselves, then it becomes the responsibility of the interpreter to provide the interpretation that will be heard. As such, depending on the settings that each one individual has their meeting set to, the camera will then show the interpreter rather than the student who's deaf or hard of hearing signing a response. Meanwhile, if multiple students are talking at the same time, the little yellow highlighting that goes from box to box to box indicating who is speaking may be delayed because this person wasn't speaking long enough for it to highlight. One of the easiest
What's worse is if more than one person is speaking at a time, A computer's microphone function may simply
If we take
freeze
these
and not
complications and we
pick up
couple them
the
with
speech
the
of
fact
any
that
of the
many
speakers
students
because it's
are
overloaded
choosing to
by
not even turn their cameras
overlapping
on,
voices.
we don't even have the ability to provide, say, a description of the person speaking. One of the most effective strategies that we can incorporate is to indicate who's speaking by naming the person. By simply starting each shift of the conversation by adding the name. Aaron's talking, and then interpreting what Aaron said. Megan's talking, interpreting what Megan said. We can't rely on saying, oh, screen corner, because my screen and your screen most likely won't look the same. That naming and labeling is something that students of the profession are often taught as being redundant, but especially given the environment that we are in right now, it is often the most pragmatic and simple solution to many of the complications that we are encountering in the classroom.
Like with any of our interpreting skills, it's important for us to build these skills by practice. If, as we're working on improving how effectively we indicate who is speaking, if we are struggling to incorporate eye gaze, indexing, body shifting, because naming or labeling is so effective, sometimes the easiest way for us to start improving our ability to indicate who is speaking is to start with that more obvious convention of naming. By starting with naming, we will then naturally be led into the process of now indexing and eye gazing, and our body will be following suit in order to show they're speaking and they're responding. And we can build on those skills and scaffold those skills until eventually, through
Let's take
further
a
use
moment
and
now to look
practice,
at
they
how
become more
this
natural.
actually works within classroom discourse. Understand that classroom discourse has various components. You may have teacher discourse. The teacher is delivering a lesson. The teacher is addressing a student. The teacher is having a meeting one-on-one with each student in turn. There's also student discourse, students who are delivering speeches, students who are doing popcorn reading during a lesson, students that are engaged in a Socratic seminar as they are, debating the merits of a particular reading text. We have group discourse as students are working on projects together to problem solve, to put together a report, to do a lab in a chemistry class. These are all different levels of discourse and they all have different needs.
These are the most common discourse styles, discourse settings that we would see in a classroom. However, it's important that we understand as well, though, that these are not the only types of discourse that occur in a classroom. We may have to deal with discourse that comes from announcements that are made over a public address system or emergency announcements. We may have to manage discourse that is happening between two students that is meant to be secretive. We may have to deal with discourse that comes from visitors or other interlopers who enter a classroom during
Teacher
instruction,
discourse
and their
is going
discourse
to
is separate
be,
from and different than
in most
what is
cases, the
happening
most
within the
prevalent
typical
discourse that we
classroom
have.
setting.
And that's simply by nature of the instruction that's being delivered to students. While there are instances of reverse classroom pedagogy being used within K-12, it is far less common than the traditional teaching method. The teacher delivering the instruction may be sitting at a desk, maybe standing at the board, maybe wandering around the room. Interpreters encounter all three on a daily basis. It can be challenging as the interpreter to navigate, especially that teacher discourse where the teacher is wandering around the room. We are struck with the conflict of remaining in one place to provide ease of access for the student, or following the teacher because that gives more environmental access to the student. Also, teachers who do have a tendency to navigate the classroom while delivering a lesson frequently do so by crossing in front of and between the student and the interpreter. As we indicate that the teacher is instructing, most often it's going to be when the speaker changes. If the teacher is instructing, we don't have to keep re-emphasizing the fact that the teacher is still speaking. However, it's when the teacher calls on somebody now that we have to indicate that the speaker is going to change from the person standing up here at the board to someone sitting in the classroom so that that student can provide a response. When that student is done, it's important that we actually then draw attention back to the teacher rather than just providing, oh, and then the boy finishes his sentence and then we keep interpreting. If we keep interpreting without returning the attention to the teacher who is providing the lesson, it's going to cause confusion because the student that we're interpreting for still thinks that one of his classmates is speaking. So the student has likely turned so that he can attend to the student, see that what's going on, and then look back at the interpreter, look at the student, look at the interpreter. Now that student discourse, perhaps you have multiple students providing input. I mentioned earlier popcorn reading. For those of you unfamiliar with popcorn reading, it's a strategy in which students will take turns reading from, say, a textbook. This student starts reading, reads a paragraph or a few sentences, and then this student continues, and then this student continues, and this student continues, on and on until the lesson has been read. This is an incredibly distracting and difficult strategy for students who are deaf and hard of hearing to navigate because it is very fast paced and it doesn't give the student the opportunity to track where the source of the message is.
As we look further at student discourse, another example that we may consider would be how we indicate students who, for example, tend to interrupt class a lot. Our natural inclination as educational interpreters may be to try and ignore those interruptions and continue interpreting a lesson that we feel is highly important. However, that student who is interrupting the class perhaps is a student then that others in the classroom, that student's peers, don't want to have to work with if they're working on a partner or a group project. Interpreting that interruption and indicating specifically where that interruption is coming from is very important to support a deaf and hard of hearing student's autonomy and ability and opportunity to exercise judgment in whether or not they would like to work with that student, or if they're going to end up being stuck with a student who they don't know for a group project. As we then move to consider group discourse, such as a project, a lab, a reading group, how do we manage group discourse and indicating who is speaking? Some of that may mean that we physically enter the space of the group. If they're sitting in a circle, we sit within the circle. We can indicate who is speaking by pointing at the person as we interpret their discourse. Perhaps as a group is sitting, we stand on the outside of that circle discussion, and we move to stand directly behind the person who is speaking so that a deaf and hard of hearing student can see both the person who is speaking and the interpreter within the same eye, within the same periphery, in the same
Depending
space.
on the size of the group,
In which
and the
case now
environment
we don't have to point to the person or
surrounding
name
the
the
group,
person. Our
it may
proximity to
be
that person
necessary for the
indicates who the
interpreter to
speaker
take
is.
on a little bit more of a leadership role to really help facilitate turn taking within the group environment. It is not possible for the interpreter to successfully navigate a situation where everybody in the group is speaking over one another. And it may then require the interpreter to say, hang on, I can only interpret for one person at a time. Right now, I'm interpreting for this person. When this person's done, then please proceed. While it's incredibly difficult to interject oneself into the situation this way, it may be necessary in order to successfully facilitate that communication among the members of the group.
Moving outside of simply the classroom discourse and needing to indicate who is speaking, we also can see several examples of where the skill of indicating who is speaking appears within the curriculum or the materials that are being taught. Storytelling is a prime example of places where we are going to very frequently see examples where we need to indicate who is speaking. Whether it's a children's story like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, or whether it's more complicated literature such as Shakespeare, and we see a sword fight between the Montagues and the Capulets. Our ability to utilize space and indicate who is speaking in order for the story to have cohesion and for the story to make sense and understand what is happening to whom and where and how and
As
who
we
is
start
saying
delving
what
a little bit into academic literature,
can mean the
whether
difference
it's
between a
children's
student
story or
successfully
it's a
completing
piece of classic
curriculum
literature,
or struggling
we
to
need to
complete
be able to
curriculum.
consider not only how we indicate who is speaking using those different techniques that we spoke about, but considering too the pragmatics of ASL grammar and what ASL grammar dictates as being how we address certain issues. If you look at a play that is told through the perspective of a narrator, even though is written into the story by the author, is not really part of the story. It is the character in the book that is relaying the story. And so the narrator will come in and out of the story in different places. If you think about the book, which was then later made into a movie, The Princess Bride by William Goldman. In the movie, the narrator is played by the grandfather and the grandfather's interaction with his grandson. The grandson is ill and in bed, and so the grandfather comes to read a book and make him feel better. As he gets into the story, then we will see the characters as they progress through the story, whether it's sword fights or kidnapping or rescuing the damsel in distress. We see the characters acting out the story. But we do occasionally see and hear interjections from the narrator. There are times where it will just be a voiceover that we hear, and we know it's the narrator who is separated from the story but still indicating what is happening. One particular example where we see both the interjection of the characters appearing on screen and then hearing the voices of the narrator interjecting on screen is when Princess Buttercup jumps overboard, and then Andre the Giant's character, Fezzik, has to reach in and save her from the eels. Now, the interjection can be handled a couple different ways. If we, as the interpreter, are approaching this from a discourse analysis perspective, and how do we do that? This is where we start seeing the use of neutral space. If I am doing my job as the interpreter, I am indicating who is speaking. So I might have Princess Buttercup on one side and she wants to leave because she's been kidnapped. And then I have this side where I can portray all of the perpetrators together. Within this space of the quote unquote bad guys, we have Fezzik and we have Inigo Montoya. We have those characters who were hired to kidnap Princess Buttercup. And so within this space, indicating this side of the story versus the princess who has been kidnapped, I can use finger spelling within the space to indicate exactly which character is speaking. Then, when the grandson interrupts his grandfather to say, hang on, I can step back into neutral space. And then I know that this is a little bit separate from the main story. I can do that both as, the narrator appears on screen or as just the voice appears on screen. As the voice only appears on screen, it could be that I'm staying within these spaces, but then I lean back a little bit and I comment and just kind of put it in there. So there are different grammatical strategies that we can use to indicate who is speaking as we take on more complicated storytelling.
We hope that this brief introduction into indicating who is speaking has been beneficial, informative, and helpful for you. Within the PowerPoint that we have provided to your professors, please notice on the first slide are our email addresses. And we encourage you and welcome you to reach out and email us if you have any further questions that we might be able to support for you. Additionally, within the PowerPoint, we have provided a slide that gives some example sentences for you to use in your practice and starting to incorporate some of these conventions in indicating who is
Yes,
speaking.
thank you so much. We hope that you have
We
benefited
hope that they
from
help
this
support
lesson.
your practice.
With the
We hope
sentences that we've
that
provided here
you
for your
have
practice,
learned a
there
few
are
things,
two ways for you
and
to
we thank you
utilize
for your
these
time in
within your
joining us on
deliberate
this mini
practice.
lesson.
Again, as we mentioned, we always want to start in the more simplistic, basic building block form. In this instance, we have individual sentences. What we would encourage you to do is work on each sentence individually. How could you map the sentence and how could you indicate who is speaking? Of what is the person speaking? Once you have become comfortable with each of the sentences as a standalone sentence, we would then encourage you to step back and look at this entire slide as a chunk of dialogue. Oftentimes, when we ask students what happened, if a student approaches us and is upset, or we catch something at the tail end, what happened? This is the kind of student dialogue that we frequently get. It is a rambling account of he said, she said, and trying to figure out and make heads and tails of what really happened. Please do reach out to us if you have any questions about the presentation or even specifically about this activity. We hope that you have learned something today and we have enjoyed spending the last hour with you. Thank you so much.